Hello and welcome to the VO2 Lounge. This is episode 53 on the impact of the menstrual cycle on athletic performance. The menstrual cycle's effect on physical performance is increasingly recognised as a crucial part of women's sport and a vital area for further research. Research consistently indicates that female athletes report worse performance during the early follicular phase, which starts on the first day of the menstruation and lasts until follicular development begins, and the late luteal phase occurring just before menstruation. These phases are often associated with symptoms such as cramps, fatigue, bloating, mood swings, and decreased energy levels. Objective performance measurements, including anaerobic, aerobic, and strength-related tests, show inconsistent findings regarding the menstrual cycle's impact and highlight the nuance of individual variations. Some studies report reduced anaerobic performance in certain phases, while others find no significant difference, and aerobic performance metrics such as endurance and VO2 max do not consistently vary across the menstrual cycle. Strength tests yield variable results, with some studies noting slight decreases in performance during the early follicular phase, but these findings are not universally observed. The main source for this episode is the impact of menstrual cycle phases on athletes' performance, a narrative review, which I have linked down in the show notes below if you'd like to look at it yourself. There's some very good figures in there that make it easier to understand specifically what's occurring at each phase of the menstrual cycle. It's a classic example. As I was going through really of looking at different papers, I found this review. It was ideal because the structure was ideal. It highlighted all the points I was interested in, explained it very well, highlighted the limitations in all this research, and was a classic example of the further you go out to sea, the deeper the water becomes. In the sense that in the beginning, you think, there's a couple phases. These will align to changes in hormonal balance. If you correlate these hormonal balances towards which are usually associated with higher performance, then the performance detriments will be where these hormones are low, and the performance increases will be where these hormones are high. And then you see the subjective results and you go, this makes perfect sense, that when they've got mood swings and bloating and decreased energy levels, of course they perform worse. But that's self-reported. Then you go to the objective measurements and you go, hold on a minute, there's basically no difference here. There's just natural variation. So what is actually going on here? So with all that said, let's get into this episode. Before we do, as an athlete, it can be hard to remove the emotion surrounding training and be truly objective. Maybe after a bad training session or a poor race result, you feel as though you need to go harder and dig yourself into a hole. When you start structured training for the year, when do you peak and how many goal events can I peak for? How to taper for an event without worrying about losing too much fitness. These are all questions athletes have, and this is where a coach comes into play. At the VO2 Lounge Coaching, we believe that training doesn't need to be overly complicated. What is complicated is ensuring that an athlete reaches the start line in the best physical and psychological condition that they can be. The overwhelming nature of making decisions around your training and everything else that comes with performing at your best is why coaching exists. Leave the stress of planning training, periodization, tapering, on-the-bike fueling, and even pacing strategies or race tactics to us, and join the VO2 Lounge today by emailing the vo2lounge@gmail.com, links down below to register your interest. Now, for the episode. Now, it's a good idea to start by outlining the phases of the menstrual cycle. This is where I would like to highly suggest getting the review paper previously mentioned, as Figure 1 provides an excellent visual aid to understanding what hormones are doing during what phase. Like, are they up, are they down, what are the hormones? And it's such an easy to interpret example of what's going on. Now, the menstrual cycle consists of a series of events that prepare the uterus for potential pregnancy. A regular menstrual cycle lasting between 21 and 35 days and is defined as eumenorrheic. Now, essentially, it's like metronomic's not the correct word, but it, depending on where you find it, it might be that it varies, but only within a tight tolerance of, say, a couple of days. And the menstrual cycle is divided into two main phases, follicular and luteal phases, marked by menstruation, follicular maturation, ovulation, and corpus luteum formation. However, these two phases do not fully capture the hormonal variations within the cycle. Therefore, the menstrual cycle is typically described in research using subphases: early follicular, late follicular, ovulatory, early luteal, mid luteal, and late luteal. Which kind of, when you see the graph, you see why just having two phases is a bit coarse for really understanding what's going on, because within those two phases there's quite a big shift in what's going on in those periods. Now, the subphases of the menstrual cycle are characterized by fluctuations in female sex hormones such as estrogen, progesterone, follicular stimulating hormone or FSH, luteinizing hormone LH, which, if you've ever listened to any kind of, particularly the more plates, more dates kind of content, you'll hear luteinizing hormone quite a lot. Features here as well. The early follicular phase begins with menstruation lasting 4 to 6 days, during which hormone levels are low and stable. The follicular phase continues until ovulation, with an increase in estrogen during the late follicular phase as ovarian follicles mature. The rise in estrogen triggers surge in LH, leading to ovulation, where the mature follicular releases an egg. Now, following ovulation, the early luteal phase begins, characterized by the formation of the corpus luteum, which secretes progesterone and a small amount of estrogen. The mid-luteal phase sees peak progesterone and secondary estrogen peak, preparing the endometrium for potential implantation. So the egg essentially nestling itself in the uterus wall. If fertilization does not occur, the corpus luteum degrades, causing the decline in progesterone and estrogen during the late luteal phase, leading to menstruation as the cycle restarts. And that's where you have the shedding and bleeding, which is just the shedding of that lining. Now, the menstrual cycle typically begins around age 13. This is a rough estimate, doesn't mean if someone's... That's just the average. Now, 13, and continues regularly until premenopause around age 45, unless interrupted by pregnancy, hormonal contraceptives, like the pill, for example, or menstrual ovulatory dysfunction. Approximately 67 to 91%. Big band, but all of them are over 50%, which is kind of the big number there, is the fact that it's over 1 in 2 of elite female athletes are not, it's the numenorrheic, which about half not using hormonal contraceptives, indicating that many female athletes experience natural hormonal fluctuations. So it's saying that the norm is not for women to have significant fluctuations / a stop or the reduction in the frequency and metronomic nature of their menstrual cycle. So having your period stop, for example, is not considered the norm, given that approximately 67 to 91% of elite females, not the general public, elite, are not suffering from this disturbance. So it's just a thought, because from my standpoint, elites, there is a correlation from a subjective point of view of, the assumption that a lot of these women are having either a suppressed or reduced or just non-regular menstrual cycle, for example. But according to this research, elites are experiencing it on a pretty consistent basis from the standpoint of the percentages of individuals. If you've made it this far, I'm assuming you're enjoying the episode at this point. If that's the case, why not like, share, and follow the podcast wherever you get your podcasts from, and be sure to recommend it to a friend to help the podcast grow and spread it to more people. So with the basics kind of out the way, and I say basics, but it's not the most obvious thing in the world that, well, let's go into what this episode is really about, and that's what the effects are of the menstrual cycle on performance. Now, physical performance in women can change throughout the menstrual cycle due to various factors like muscular activation, metabolism, thermoregulation, and the body and just body composition. Now, hormones such as estrogen and progesterone influence these changes. Now, estrogen tends to boost muscle strength and power by increasing neuron excitability, while progesterone has the opposite effect, inhibiting the cortical excitability. Now, this results in strength and power, which might be higher when the estrogen peaks during the late follicular phase and lower when progesterone is elevated during the luteal phase. Now, rapid force production, crucial for explosive movements like a clean and jerk, sprinting, those kind of activities like powerful exercises where you're moving either a lot of what you're just moving something quickly, can also be influenced by the menstrual cycle phases, with some studies showing that higher muscle activation in the late luteal phase compared to early follicular phase. Now, testosterone levels, which can enhance physical performance, as we should all know, key doping drug here, vary across the menstrual cycle, peaking during the ovulatory phase. However, it's unclear if this increase affects bioavailable testosterone and thus the strength of the individual. Muscle and tendon stiffness, which can impact performance and injury risk, might also fluctuate with the menstrual cycle. Some studies suggest that estrogen decreases stiffness by reducing collagen synthesis, while others find no significant changes in the tissue stiffness across the different phases. Now, as always, studies, it's kind of like just saying this is a possibility, so you never know. Maybe you go out on long runs around these phases and you notice, picking running in particular because of the impact. It could just be doing a team sport or something, whereas something like cycling, less so. Swimming, there's a lot of force production, but still, you may find that doing your longer duration sessions, whether that's a longer football session, whether it's a longer run, results in more agitation of any tendons and ligaments. And maybe that correlates towards different phases in the menstrual cycle. So it's something to bear in mind, I always find. When you read these things, go, I'll look out for this. And maybe you go, I kept on just happening to get a niggle at this time, but I just correlated it to, I don't know, a bit of overtraining, for example. Whereas maybe the margins are that fine that you're just easier to overdo it slightly. Thermoregulation, or the body's ability to maintain its temperature, is another factor influenced by the menstrual cycle. Higher progesterone levels in the luteal phase raise body temperature, which can improve short duration activities, require speed and power. However, the longer activity this increases may cause greater strain on the potentially limit endurance performance. Particularly, obviously, if you're in a hot climate or you're going to do a hot race, these are again things that essentially women have to think about, that conveniently for men you don't really have to. You are acclimatizing to the heat. I suppose you could argue to some extent that you don't have control on when it happens, so you take the same precautions of heat acclimation, hydration, so on and so forth. It's just that maybe it is worth bearing it in mind, that maybe your heat tolerance is not going to be as good for that phase, and therefore you approach a race, say it's hot, and normally you wouldn't need like slush mix or ice down your jersey, for example. Maybe you come to that race knowing where you are in that phase, like where you are on your heat tolerance kind of curve. And if you're going to be arriving to that race in poor condition due to the menstrual cycle, then it's a possibility that you then over cool for what you normally would do, but is adequate and representative of where you currently are. Metabolism, including the use of carbohydrates and fats for energy, can vary across the menstrual cycle. Estrogen promotes fat oxidation while progesterone limits it. This can affect endurance performance, especially at higher exercise intensities, such as studies show mixed results, with some indicating greater fat oxidation during the luteal phase and others finding no significant differences. Body composition might also change with the menstrual cycle, which again can influence performance. Increased body mass associated with decreased aerobic and anaerobic performance can occur in the luteal phase due to factors like fluid retention and changes in appetite driven by hormonal fluctuations. However, studies on body composition changes through the menstrual cycle are inconsistent, with some showing significant changes and others finding none. I suppose body composition, depending how they're determining it, especially if it's through DEXA, for example, and you're getting lean mass, the luteal phase resulting in the fluid retention and changes in appetite, for example. Specifically the fluid retention, it can simply just be that you are showing a higher lean mass because you've got more fluid retained in the body. Really, this section of the review paper to me just highlighted how nuanced it is, and almost how, one, we will get on to tracking. However, it's the fact that it advocates strongly for both tracking of your cycle, but also a training diary for some period of time where you are in that diary making note of where you are in your cycle, and also making note of lots of different things like what the temperature was, what you wore, was it what you normally wear, did you feel warm, did you feel like you were bonking because you did a 5-hour ride, and according to this, glucose and fat oxidation could be in different locations, and what did you do to counteract it? What I always question with studies like this is because this is a review, even when you read the paper, to be fair, because you're always like, how many of these papers showed null findings, and how many of these have found findings and they're the ones that get published and the null finding ones don't, which muddies the water a little bit and makes it so that when you consider these, what's the magnitude of this effect? Because yeah, sure, if you're elite, top end elite, then you should be doing this anyway because you're after every kind of gain possible. But is this like a 0.2% improvement or a 0.2% reduction in thermal regulation, for example, or fat oxidation or glucose like what is the magnitude of this change? But again, it's just the fact that it is possible that there will be a change. So anything you take from this isn't like a hard and fast rule of during X phase, this happens means you need to do this, otherwise X reduction in performance. It's more like during this phase, this does happen in the sense that these hormones do shift, the magnitude of which varies upon the individual. As a result, the magnitude of the effects that happen vary or may not even happen at all in that individual. And then further on from that, your individual response, objectively and subjectively, are equally going to be different. And the purpose of this episode and the purpose of actually monitoring your cycle or an individual monitoring their cycle, or a coach monitoring their athlete cycle, is not to be able to go, aha, yeah, look, you are on day 15, progesterone's doing this, testosterone's doing this, you lifted more weights. And look, there you go. That is evidence that this paper checks out. It's more a purpose of, all right, raise your own awareness towards these different factors and try achieve the best performance possible. That is kind of all I suppose in the example I gave, you are achieving the highest performance, but the example would be you do all those things right and then you don't lift the heavier weight and you go, this doesn't make sense. Science doesn't check out. What you do in that instance is you go, okay, maybe this doesn't work for me. And then you find out what does. All we are doing is chasing performance and happiness of the individual, because it may even be long term. We're looking at, say, like a 3-year plan. It may be that every 4th week, every 3rd week, when you land on that day, you're going to do your long run, long ride, long training session, heavy lifting session. You go, subjectively, you feel terrible. Not objectively, you could still lift, still run, still cycle, still do whatever it is, but subjectively you feel horrendous. So you shift that, or that week, for example, is a semi-deload week where you don't have the huge volume day or the huge power day or interval day, whatever it is. You just don't have that that session, essentially. You push it down the road or you can it completely for that week. Now, as I mentioned, monitoring an individual's menstrual cycle, you can't choose when you enter each phase, but you can do the next best thing, and that's monitor your cycle, essentially. Now, monitoring of the menstrual cycle in elite sports is becoming more and more common. Top sports organizations like Chelsea Football Club and the United States Women's National Football Team, soccer, should I say, because it's America, and swimming teams now use commercial smartphone apps to track elite athletes' menstrual cycles. Athletes use these apps to log their periods and menstrual symptoms, and coaches can access this data to see if performance or readiness changes during different phases of the cycle. If patterns are detected, personalized strategies are developed to address these changes, such as adjusting sleep habits, training, diet, or lifestyle based on the app's guidance. Now, this podcast is not affiliated with any of the following apps, but a list of example apps are these: Clue, Cycles, Eve, Flow, Glow, Apple Cycle Tracking. The quality of these tracking apps is greatly influenced by the inputs of the user. Just like training, the more you put in, the more you'll get out. And for all the marginal gains in cycling and running to some extent, but really marginal gains in cycling, tracking has got to be classed as a maximal gain that extends out of just sports performance and kind of bridges in to your own physical well-being or the individual's well-being, of knowing when these things are happening and being able to plan for it in advance, essentially. I would have thought is a key part, really, for most people. And especially then an event. You could almost, obviously individuals practice nutrition, they practice like training in their race kit. Well, if you know let's say you know 3 months out that, or 2 months out, that an event's going to land on a specific phase, then you can do your race sim, runs, rides, swims, whatever, in that phase to kind of characterize what you're going to feel like and start looking up some kind of either mitigation strategies or just feel really good for yourself because you know you're going to be absolutely cruising. So yeah, tracking clearly seems to be something the elites are doing, and clearly seems to be something that is performance enhancing, I suppose, for lack of a better word. So what about the perceived versus objective performance impacts on an individual? Now, many athletes feel their performance changes throughout their menstrual cycle. Studies show that between 50 and 71% of athletes think their training is affected by the menstrual cycle, and 49 to 65% say it's impacted their competition performance. Athletes often feel strongest and fastest during most phases, except the early follicular phase, right after menstruation starts, and the late luteal phase just before menstruation. During these phases, many athletes report feeling tired, sluggish, or distracted by menstrual pain, and the worry of flooding is in exclamation marks. They titled it flooding, which is essentially heavy bleeding. Now, these symptoms, common during menstruation, can make athletes feel their performance is worse. Now, fatigue during these phases might be linked to serotonin, a brain chemical that affects mood and energy. Now, estrogen, a hormone that fluctuates during the cycle, boosts serotonin. When the estrogen is low, as it's in the early follicular phase and the late luteal phases, serotonin levels drop, which can make athletes feel more tired and anxious. Women with premenstrual syndrome, or PMS, often have even lower serotonin levels, worsening these effects. Now, in one study, 44% of college athletes said menstrual symptoms hurt their performance. Fatigue and trouble concentrating were common issues, especially for the athletes. Now, on the other hand, objective measures like VO2 max and time to exhaustion showed a different trend overall. Now, out of 35 studies that this review paper decided to select based on their selection criteria, 15 found, so sub 50%, that menstrual cycle affected at least one aspect of performance, while 20 did not find any significant impact. Interestingly, the changes athletes felt in their performance didn't always match the actual measurements of their performance. So maybe they were like, yeah, my endurance is worse, yet their time to exhaustion did not change, or their VO2 max did not change. Maybe they said they felt weaker, but their strength didn't change, like their 1 rep max didn't change. Now, if we move on to the menstrual cycle's effect on aerobic endurance and anaerobic performance, so on the more cycling, running orientated part, as this podcast is mostly endurance based, but we do touch on strength based topic. 16 studies examined how the menstrual cycle affects anaerobic performance, with most, 13 of them, finding no impact, in 3 studies showing some fluctuations. Now, performance in short duration tests, like 3 minutes or less, generally weren't affected by the phases of the menstrual cycle. Now, some studies found that sprinting, jumping, and cycling performance were better during specific phases, such as the mid-luteal and ovulatory phases. One study noted that athletes were more motivated during the ovulatory phase, which might explain the improved performance, because the athlete just simply was invested more in performing better. When it comes to sprinting and jumping tasks, most studies found no difference based on the phases. Some studies did observe changes like a decline in vertical jump height in the late luteal phase, but these findings were inconsistent with others that found no change. For aerobic exercise, 6 studies reported that menstrual cycle phases affected performance, while 14 studies found no impact. Most endurance tests, such as time to exhaustion and maximal treadmill or cycle tests, showed no effect on, I'll just start saying MC for menstrual cycle, MC phases. This suggests that even if metabolism changes with the MC, it doesn't necessarily impact performance. Now, intermittent endurance performance, like in interval tests, seem more likely to be affected by the MC phases. Some studies found improvements in early and late follicular phases, while others noted decreases during the luteal phases. This essentially could be due to less thermoregulatory and cardiovascular strain during the follicular phases. So essentially, it's just like there is obviously going to be different levels of stress on the body, and then depending how taxing the activity is, determines whether that additional strain is enough to reduce, inhibit, or improve performance, essentially. Now, mechanical efficiency might also be influenced by MC phases, but the impact on performance is unclear, really. Some studies found participants were less economical in the mid-luteal phase, while others found they were more economical. Differences in testing protocols might explain these fluctuating results, which I think is an important bit. It's why I quite like review papers. Now, I could be completely wrong. I'm not a researcher. I'm not in this field. It has nothing to do with my job. However, I find when you pick individual studies, even if I were to pick 3 for this episode, one, often the testing modalities are maybe the same in general, but the actual tool, but the protocol. So like a protocol difference could be 2 tests are both. We'll do the cycling and we could do the cycling and running with the same sort of methodology. So you could be trying to test VO2 max on a cycling ergometer, so like a Wahoo Kicker, or you could be doing a VO2 max test on a treadmill. So the same, like you're getting the same result at the end, VO2 max. You're using the same training modality of using a ergometer, or in the case of running, a treadmill. However, the protocol could be different. So in one group, it could be a ramp test where you increase the pace or the wattage by like 5% every 2 minutes. The other could be 5% every 1 minute. The other may not be a ramp test in such small increments. It could be a steady state test. It could be run at your fastest 8-minute pace. In the case of FTP, for example, like that, or the VO2 max, it may just be, we're going to do 1 block at 50% of max, 1 block at 80% of max, and then just go as hard as you can. Not saying these are protocols that people use, and then for cycling, because it's even easier, you're trying to test for FTP, and you could do a ramp test, you could do a 20-minute test, you could do an 8-minute test, you could do an hour power test. There's just so many different protocols to achieve the same thing using the same training modality, which is some form of interval, but on a bike using a power meter. So that's where these studies can vary, the results can vary, the selection criteria varies, and review papers essentially are I find, yes, shit in gets shit out, but for the most part, I find them easier to interpret, but also more likely to pull up the fact that, look, modalities are different, the outcomes are not significant really, even if they say they are significant for the most part. And you also have the chance, if there's something outrageous in there, like you're like, oh my God, that sounds like an unbelievable performance advantage, you can then pick that study yourself, look at it, and then go make your own decision. So I think review papers, for anyone who wants to do their own little bits of research on PubMed to kind of educate their training or get a good understanding of how to do training and so on and so forth, the review papers are pretty good. And this is kind of highlighted that. Now, I think I was on maximal oxygen uptake. So VO2 max usually doesn't change across menstrual phases. Most studies found no significant differences between phases. Now, only one study reported a slight increase in the early follicular phase compared to the mid-luteal phase. Now, overall, while athletes' perceptions of their performance often change, and is still a credible reason as to why you would monitor, but objective measures of performance show mixed results. So even if it is a case where you as the athlete or the coach knows that in this individual there is no objective change, like they either can run a 20-minute 5K or they can do 300 watts for an hour, depending what their sport is, at any point in the phase, but you know from their own like RPE essentially is increasing, well, maybe for them doing a 20-minute 5K, although it's a maximal effort, when they finish, they're like, oh, that was an 8 out of 10, really. I could have gone a little bit harder, even though they couldn't. When they come back and they're at a different phase, they may come back and hit the same number, be like, that was a 10 out of 10. I couldn't have given anything more. What was my time? And you go, it was the same. And they're like, what? This doesn't make sense. So that's all this is really saying. It's like objective measures may or may not change. Subjective measures 100% seem to change. It seems to be a vast majority reporting that there is a change, although their performance outcomes aren't actually changing. Now, we've covered obviously aerobic and anaerobic work, but something else is the fact that muscular strength seems more likely to be affected by the menstrual cycle. than aerobic and anaerobic performance. Out of the studies reviewed, 5 reported that strength variations within the menstrual cycle phases, while 5 found no effect and 1 reported mixed results. 2 studies found that strength increased during the early and late follicular phases, likely due to higher estrogen and lower progesterone levels. However, other studies did not find significant differences between these phases and others parts of the cycle. For example, some studies found no difference in strength between the late follicular and mid-luteal phases, and other studies even found lower strength in the early follicular phase compared to the mid-late luteal phases. Another study found increased strength during the luteal phase, and others observed increased strength during the ovulatory phase. Now, 2 studies examined strength in both dominant and non-dominant limbs. They found significant increases in dominant hand grip strength in the late follicular phase, and others unspecified differences in non-dominant hand grip strength. The hamstring to quadricep strength ratio in non-dominant leg decreased in the follicular phase compared to the luteal phase, but there was no change in the dominant leg. The results suggest that really the phases of the menstrual cycle can affect strength differently in various muscles or muscle groups in a very nuanced way. Like when we're talking about hamstring to quadricep balance, we're talking moderately nuanced here. And it just seems strength. I almost wonder whether, at least from my point of view, when I'm approaching a bike session, even if it's a hard session, like it's anything really sub VO2 work. So like anything over about 4 minutes. So say an 8 minute, a 10 minute, 20 minute interval. I can approach it feeling pretty flat and still do well. And I can, again, approach a crit because it's about an hour, again, also do fairly well. Road race, a bit different, depends on the level. Want to kind of feel pretty fresh for them. Whereas the gym, if I turn up to the gym and I've got to do some weights, even if it's hypertrophic work, like it's higher reps, you still, at the final 3 reps, are pretty hard. And if I come in feeling flat, not really there, warm up, get through that, and I'm still flat, I may as well go home because it's going to be grueling. Like I want to arrive to the gym feeling psychologically all there, and physically I can ache, but I want to cognitively be on the ball. And yes, these are subjective. These are objective measures that they were discussing, but I think it's easier because of the nature of the duration of like power data. If you're doing 10-minute average, it's easier to kind of like just maybe start off a bit weak and kind of there's a longer period of time to get a good average. Whereas strength, you try to move heavy weight and you're just not in tune, you're not lifting that heavy weight. So even if it's a one-off maximal effort, you're just not lifting it. So I think maybe that's why there's a greater correlation between why there's a greater evidence for there being an actual objective impact on strength. But that's just an observation, just a thought from my own personal mind state of obviously not being, as a male, not someone who suffers or experiences, should I say, the menstrual cycle. I can't say what a woman's going through, but I can say myself, when I'm in a demotivated state, that I also, really struggle with short bouts of high intensity. So really, to wrap this episode up, we can say that the menstrual cycle is a process driven by intricate hormonal changes within a woman's body. Athletes often report experiencing fluctuations in their performance throughout the menstrual cycle. There are phases of which the menstrual cycle where performance may peak but also trough. It's essential to recognize that the relationship between the menstrual cycle and athletic performance is complex and multifaceted. Not all studies have observed significant performance changes across the menstrual cycle phases, and the magnitude and direction of these changes can vary widely among individuals. The methodological differences across studies, including variations in sample sizes, study designs, and outcome measures, can contribute to inconsistencies in research findings. The influence of MC on athletic performance is not limited to physiological factors alone. Psychological variables such as motivation, mood, and perceived exertion may also fluctuate across the phases, potentially impacting the athlete's readiness to train or compete. So something always to bear in mind. To complicate matters even further, individual athletes may respond differently to changes in hormonal status, and it just suggests a need for personalized approaches to training and performance management. Hence why elites tend to have coaches. Yes, there are people in different spheres who are elite and pro, they do it for a living and they don't have coaches. Like take gravel racing for an example. There are people just self-coached. But maybe they have a better support network or people to bounce ideas off and people to manage the low periods. Some people don't have that. Maybe they don't have a sporting family, a sporting family, who maybe they don't understand the ebbs and flows of sport or their sport specifically, or maybe they just need someone who cares about their training as much as they do. And so as I mentioned earlier, if you're interested in coaching or being coached, contact the VO2 Lounge at gmail.com. Now, for more content like this, explore my previous episodes and consider following, rating, and sharing the podcast wherever you get your podcasts from. Share your thoughts and suggest future topics at the VO2 Lounge at gmail.com or the VO2 Lounge Discord server. Links will all be down below. Thank you for tuning in. Until next time, it's goodbye.